Some humiliations don't happen in private. They happen right across the dinner table while everyone smiles and keeps eating. I turned 70 on a cold Friday night in November, and for the first time in years, I truly believe my family wanted to celebrate me. My son Daniel had reserved a private room at a steakhouse outside Columbus, one of those upscale places with dim lighting, polished wine glasses, and waiters who called everyone sir and ma'am. The kind of restaurant I would never choose for myself because I still checked price tags before ordering dessert. But that night, I allowed myself to feel special. I even wore the pearl earrings my late husband gave me on our 40th anniversary. Melissa greeted me at the entrance with a bright smile and both hands wrapped around my arm like we were close friends instead of people who spent most holidays carefully avoiding real conversation. "Happy birthday, Evelyn," she said sweetly. "Tonight is all about you." That should have been my first warning. Melissa was never sweet without a reason. Still, I ignored the little voice in my head because my grandchildren were there, and seeing them together around one table made every lonely sacrifice of the last 12 years feel worth it. My granddaughter Sophie ran up first and hugged me around the waist. Ethan followed behind her carrying a handmade birthday card with glitter falling off the edges. I laughed and told him it was perfect anyway. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Better than normal, actually. Daniel poured me a glass of Chardonnay. Melissa complimented my hair. Even the waitress smiled when she heard it was my 70th birthday. And sitting there beneath the soft golden lights, hearing plates clink and my grandchildren laugh over bread rolls, I made the mistake of thinking maybe things had changed. Maybe Melissa finally appreciated everything I had done for them. Because the truth was, I practically raised those children. When Sophie was born premature, I spent 3 weeks sleeping in a stiff hospital chair while Melissa went home every night exhausted from stress. When Ethan developed asthma at 6, I was the one driving him to specialist appointments 2 counties away because Daniel couldn't miss work and Melissa said hospitals made her anxious. I canceled vacations. I drained savings. I sold my Buick after Harold died because helping my family mattered more than comfort. I never kept score. That's what mothers and grandmothers do. We love first and count later. Dinner arrived, and for almost an hour, it felt like one of those happy family commercials you see during football season. Melissa laughed loudly at Daniel's jokes. Sophie showed me photos from school. Ethan asked if I still made my cinnamon pancakes. I remember thinking maybe this was the reward people talked about when they said family was everything. Then dessert came out. A chocolate cake with white frosting and silver candles shaped like the number 70. Everyone sang. I smiled so hard my cheeks hurt. And right after I blew out the candles, Melissa reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a long white envelope. She slid it slowly across the table until it stopped directly in front of me. "Before we finish tonight," she said with a calm little smile, "there's actually something we've been meaning to discuss with you." The room suddenly felt colder, even with all those people around me. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the tablecloth, and something deep in my stomach told me my birthday dinner was about to become the most humiliating night of my life. I looked down at the envelope for several seconds before touching it. The entire table had gone strangely quiet, like everyone was waiting for me to perform in a play I had never agreed to join. Melissa leaned back in her chair with that polished little smile she used whenever she wanted to appear reasonable. "Go ahead," she said softly. "It is just something we thought needed to be addressed." My fingers suddenly felt stiff as I opened the flap. Inside was a neatly folded packet of papers printed on expensive cream-colored stationery. At first, I honestly thought it might be some kind of joke. Maybe old family photos. Maybe a letter from my grandchildren. But then I saw the bold words at the top of the first page. Reimbursement summary. I blinked once, certain I had misunderstood. Then my eyes moved lower. Childcare assistance. Grocery overages. Transportation expenses. Holiday support contributions. I felt the blood drain from my face. Melissa picked up her wine glass calmly while I stared at line after line of charges assigned to me, as if loving my family had somehow become a financial crime. "We spent a long time calculating everything fairly," she said. "You always insisted on helping, but honestly, over the years it became a little excessive." Daniel still would not look at me. My own son sat there studying the edge of his plate, while his wife explained my existence like an unpaid invoice that had finally come due. I swallowed hard and turned another page. 12 years of numbers. 12 years reduced to totals and percentages. There was even a section labeled emotional dependency strain. I thought I had read it wrong at first. But no. Melissa had apparently assigned a dollar amount to the stress of constant grandmother involvement. Sophie looked confused beside me. "Mom," she whispered carefully, "what is Grandma reading?" Melissa immediately smiled at her daughter in that fake reassuring way. "Just grown-up budgeting stuff, sweetheart." Budgeting. That word nearly made me laugh. Because I remembered budgeting. I remembered clipping grocery coupons after Harold died because Daniel had called crying about daycare costs. I remembered mailing checks anonymously so they would not feel embarrassed about late mortgage payments. I remembered standing in line at a pharmacy at 2 in the morning, holding Ethan against my shoulder while he wheezed through another asthma attack. Funny how none of those moments had been expensive enough for them to remember until now. Melissa gently tapped one manicured fingernail against the table. "The total is on the last page." I should not have looked, but I did. $43,000. My stomach tightened so sharply I thought I might actually be sick right there beside the birthday cake. "Melissa," I finally said quietly, "you cannot possibly be serious." "Actually, we are," she replied. "You have always acted like raising the kids gave you some kind of authority in this family. We thought it was time to establish boundaries." Boundaries. That word hurt even more than the number. Because the truth was, I had spent years convincing myself Melissa tolerated me out of stress, or exhaustion, or personality differences. But sitting there under those restaurant lights, I realized something much colder. She genuinely resented me for being useful. She hated that her children loved me. She hated that Daniel called me whenever life fell apart. Most of all, she hated that I had quietly held their family together for years without asking for praise. One of the waiters approached cautiously holding a tray with coffee cups, but he stopped when he sensed the tension at the table. I could practically feel nearby diners pretending not to listen. My cheeks burned with humiliation, but strangely, I did not cry. I did not yell either. Instead, I carefully placed the papers back into the envelope and folded my hands in my lap. Melissa looked almost disappointed by my calmness. She had expected emotion, embarrassment, maybe even begging. But at 70 years old, after burying a husband and surviving enough disappointments to fill a lifetime, I had learned something important about humiliation. The quieter you become, the more nervous cruel people get. And for the first time that evening, I noticed Melissa stop smiling. Melissa picked up her fork again as if nothing unusual had happened. That was the part one remember most clearly afterward. Not the invoice itself. Not the amount. It was the casualness. The way she calmly cut into her chocolate cake while my entire world shifted beneath me. "Nobody is trying to hurt your feelings," she said lightly. "We just think relationships should be balanced." Balanced? I stared at her for a moment, trying to understand how a woman I had helped for over a decade could sit there discussing love like a business contract. Daniel finally cleared his throat beside her. "Mom," he muttered quietly, "maybe we should have talked about this privately first." Melissa immediately turned toward him. "Why privately? We are all family here." Her tone stayed soft, but I noticed the sharpness underneath it. Daniel shrank back into silence. Almost instantly. That told me everything I needed to know. Sophie looked back and forth between us nervously. "Grandma," she asked carefully, "are you okay?" I forced a smile for her sake. "I am fine, sweetheart." But the truth was, something inside me had gone cold. Not broken. Cold. There is a difference. Broken people beg to be loved again. Cold people start seeing clearly. Ethan glanced at the papers still sitting beside my plate. "Dad," he asked awkwardly, "why does Grandma owe money?" Daniel rubbed his forehead hard like he suddenly had a migraine. Before he could answer, Melissa jumped in again. "Nobody owes anybody anything. We are just talking about fairness." Fairness. That word kept landing like a stone in my chest. Because fairness would have meant acknowledging every soccer practice I drove to in snowstorms. Fairness would have meant remembering who stayed awake overnight helping Ethan breathe through asthma attacks while Melissa posted beach photos from Arizona. Fairness would have meant not humiliating a 70-year-old woman in the middle of her own birthday dinner. The waiter finally returned with coffee, but his expression had changed. He moved carefully around the table, avoiding eye contact the way people do when they accidentally witness something deeply uncomfortable. I suddenly realized other diners had definitely heard parts of the conversation. A couple seated nearby kept glancing over before quickly looking away. Melissa noticed too, but instead of embarrassment, She almost seemed energized by the attention. Some people enjoy power most when there is an audience. Honestly, Evelyn, she continued, dabbing her mouth with a napkin, you inserted yourself into our parenting for years. The kids depended on you too much. Sometimes it felt like you wanted to replace me. That sentence hit harder than the invoice. Replace her. I remembered every time Melissa dropped the children at my house with barely 10 minutes notice. Every emergency call. Every weekend trip she suddenly needed for mental health. I had spent years convincing myself I was helping a stressed young mother. Now I realized she had quietly rewritten history inside her own head until my sacrifices became offenses against her. I slowly reached for my purse. Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly. You are not upset, are you? She asked. I looked directly at her for the first time all evening. No, I said calmly. I think I finally understand. Something about my voice made her straighten in her chair. She expected tears, maybe outrage. But calmness unsettles cruel people because they lose control of the performance. Daniel finally looked up at me then, guilt all over his face. Mom, maybe we can talk later, he said weakly. There is nothing left to discuss tonight. I stood carefully, smoothing the front of my navy sweater. Sophie immediately grabbed my hand. Grandma, are you leaving already? My chest tightened seeing the worry in her eyes. I bent down and kissed the top of her head gently. I'm just tired, sweetheart. Ethan looked confused and uncomfortable. Poor boy. Children always know when adults are lying, even if they do not understand why. Melissa crossed her arms slightly. Well, I hope you understand this was necessary. I picked up the envelope and tucked it neatly into my purse. Then I looked at her with the same calm expression I used years ago when handling difficult customers at the bank. Oh, Melissa, I said quietly, I understand much more than you think. And for the first time since dessert arrived, I saw a genuine uncertainty flicker across her face. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though the restaurant was only 20 minutes from my neighborhood. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while the envelope sat on the passenger seat beside me like something poisonous. I kept glancing at it at red lights, half expecting the numbers inside to somehow rearrange themselves into a misunderstanding. But humiliation does not become softer with distance. It only becomes clearer. When I finally pulled into my driveway, my little white colonial house looked exactly the same as it always had. The porch light glowed warmly. Harold's old wind chimes swayed near the front steps. Everything appeared peaceful from the outside, which somehow made the ache inside my chest worse. I unlocked the front door slowly and stepped into the silence. No grandchildren running through the hallway. No cartoons playing in the living room. No backpacks tossed beside the staircase. Just quiet. For years I used to complain to Harold that the house felt too noisy whenever the children stayed over. Funny how silence becomes unbearable once you realize nobody truly needs you anymore. I hung my coat carefully by the door and walked into the kitchen. There were still birthday flowers sitting on the counter from my church friends earlier that morning. Yellow roses. Sunflowers. A handwritten card that said 70 looks beautiful on you. I stared at those flowers for a long time before finally sitting down at the kitchen table with the envelope again. The house smelled faintly like cinnamon because I had baked cookies for Ethan the night before. He loved snickerdoodles ever since he was little. I remembered him at age 5 standing on a chair beside me wearing Harold's oversized apron, sneezing flour everywhere and laughing so hard he nearly fell off the counter stool. Back then Melissa used to call me crying from work because daycare kept sending him home sick. I do not know what I would do without you, she told me once. I remember the exact moment because I believed her. That was the dangerous thing about love. You rarely notice when gratitude slowly turns into entitlement. I opened the packet again and read every page more carefully this time. The cruelty was not only in the amount. It was in the details. Melissa had listed gas mileage reimbursements for driving the children to school, grocery percentages for meals eaten at my house, holiday babysitting estimates. There was even a note claiming my involvement caused confusion in parental authority. I actually laughed at that part, but it was not a happy laugh. It was the sound people make when pain becomes too absurd to process normally. Around midnight, my phone finally rang. Daniel. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Mom, he said quietly, are you home? I assume you know I am. A long silence followed. Melissa did not mean for things to go that way. I closed my eyes. Then how exactly did she mean for it to go? He exhaled. heavily. She thinks boundaries got blurred over the years. No, Daniel, I said calmly. Boundaries did not blur. Responsibilities did. You and your wife handed me half your parenting duties for 12 years, and now she resents me because the children love me for it. He did not deny it. That hurt more than if he had argued. Mom, please do not make this bigger than it is. I looked around my quiet kitchen and suddenly understood something painful about my son. He still thought this was about money. Men like Daniel often mistake peacekeeping for goodness. He believed if everybody stopped talking about something uncomfortable, the problem disappeared. But disrespect does not disappear. It settles into the walls of a relationship until one day you realize there is nothing left holding the family together except habit. You embarrassed me in front of my grandchildren on my 70th birthday, I said softly. And you sat there while it happened. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. I did not know she was bringing the invoice tonight. That sentence told me more than he intended. Invoice. Not misunderstanding. Not mistake. Invoice. Which meant they had discussed it together beforehand. Planned it. Printed it. Folded it neatly into that envelope while pretending to organize a birthday dinner for me. Something inside me became very still then. Not angry. Not emotional. Just clear. And clarity can be a very dangerous thing. 3 days passed before I saw Melissa again. Not because she apologized. Not because Daniel tried to repair anything. The only reason I ended up near their house was because Sophie had a choir recital at her middle school, and despite everything that happened, I still could not imagine missing it. That was the problem with loving children. They become tied to your heart separately from the adults who disappoint you. I arrived early and sat near the back of the auditorium wearing my gray wool coat and holding the small bouquet of pink carnations I planned to give Sophie afterward. Families filled the rows around me talking loudly about report cards, soccer schedules, and Thanksgiving plans. Normal life. It felt strange how the world kept moving. After your heart changed shape, Sophie spotted me before the performance started and waved excitedly from the stage. Melissa noticed too. For a brief second, our eyes met across the auditorium. She immediately looked away. Not guilty. Uncomfortable. There is a difference. Guilty people avoid your eyes because they know they hurt you. Uncomfortable people avoid your eyes because they do not want to deal with consequences. The recital ended around 8 o'clock. Parents crowded the hallway taking photos while children laughed and ran between groups. I gave Sophie the flowers and hugged her tightly. You sang beautifully, I told her honestly. She smiled in that sweet, awkward middle school way and whispered, Mom said you were upset about some grown-up stuff. I swallowed carefully. Your grandmother is fine, sweetheart. Melissa appeared beside us almost immediately. Sophie, why do not you go wait by Dad in the lobby? Sophie hesitated before walking away. The second she disappeared into the crowd, Melissa crossed her arms lightly. I did not expect you to come tonight. I came for my granddaughter. Right. Her tone carried that familiar sharp politeness again. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Melissa leaned slightly closer and lowered her voice. I hope you are not planning to make things difficult after the dinner. I stared at her calmly. Difficult for who? She exhaled impatiently. Evelyn, let us not pretend this is emotional. We are trying to establish healthier financial boundaries. Financial? There it was again. Every conversation somehow circled back to money. Suddenly, I noticed the designer handbag hanging from her shoulder. New. The same with the boots. And if I remembered correctly, Daniel had recently upgraded to a luxury SUV despite constantly complaining about expenses. Something clicked quietly into place in my mind. You are having money problems, I said. Melissa's face changed instantly. Only for half a second, but enough. Excuse me. That invoice was not about boundaries. I continued softly. You need something. Her expression hardened. You do not know what you are talking about. But I already did. Once you stop viewing people emotionally, patterns become obvious. Melissa was not cruel for entertainment. She was desperate. I thought back carefully over the past year. Daniel mentioning credit card stress. Melissa suddenly pushing conversations about retirement planning. Questions about my house value that seemed casual at the time. Even the birthday dinner itself suddenly felt less personal and more strategic. How bad is it? I asked quietly. Melissa laughed once without humor. You really think highly of yourself if you believe this family revolves around your money. I did not answer immediately because the truth no longer needed defending. People reveal themselves most clearly when they feel cornered. You know what your problem is? She continued. You always wanted to be needed. You loved acting like the hero. Hero. That word almost amused me. Heroes usually get thanked eventually. No, I said calmly. I loved my family. Something flickered across her face then. Not sympathy. Frustration. Because deep down, people like Melissa cannot fully understand unconditional love. Everything becomes transactional to them eventually. Before she could respond again, Daniel approached holding Ethan's backpack. The second he sensed tension, his shoulders tightened. Everything okay? He asked nervously. Melissa instantly smiled again. Of course. The transformation happened so fast, it was almost impressive. She slipped her arm through Daniel's and turned toward the parking lot. But before leaving, she looked back at me one last time. Just remember, she said softly. People who live alone should not make family situations harder than they need to be. It sounded harmless on the surface, but underneath it said a warning. And as I watched their expensive SUV pull away from the curb, I realized something chilling. Melissa was not just trying to humiliate me anymore. She was preparing to control me. The following Monday morning, I scheduled an appointment with my attorney. Not because I was emotional, not because I wanted revenge. At least that is what I told myself while driving downtown beneath a gray Ohio sky. The truth was simpler than that. I finally understood I had spent years treating my family like loved ones while they had quietly started treating me like an asset. And once that realization settles into your bones, you either become bitter or careful. I chose careful. Harold and I first hired Martin Klein nearly 30 years earlier when we bought the lake cabin outside Geneva on the lake. Back then Daniel was still in high school, all awkward shoulders and football jackets. Martin had gray hair now and thicker glasses, but he still recognized me immediately when I walked into his office. Evelyn Carter, he said warmly. 70 years old and still intimidating everyone in a navy sweater. I smiled faintly for the first time in days. Do not flatter me before charging hourly rates. He laughed and motioned for me to sit. The office smelled like old leather and coffee. Familiar. Safe. After the birthday dinner, safety felt strangely valuable. Martin noticed my expression almost immediately. What happened? He asked gently. I reached into my purse and handed him the invoice packet without a word. He adjusted his glasses and read quietly for several minutes. The deeper he got into the pages, the tighter his mouth became. Finally, he removed the glasses completely and stared at me across the desk. Your daughter-in-law gave you this? At my birthday dinner. In public. I nodded once. Martin leaned back slowly in his chair. Evelyn, this is not normal family conflict. I know. And I did know now. That was the frightening part. Once humiliation burns away denial, you start seeing things with uncomfortable precision. Martin folded his hands carefully. What exactly do you want to do? I looked out the office window toward the parking garage across the street. For years, every legal document I signed had one purpose, making life easier for Daniel eventually. Harold and I built everything around that assumption. The house, investments, the cabin, savings accounts for the grandchildren. Even my will still named Daniel as executor because I trusted him to protect the family. Now I pictured him sitting silently beside Melissa while she publicly assigned dollar values to my love. I want control back, I said quietly. Martin nodded once like he already understood. For the next 2 hours, we reviewed every account I owned. Retirement funds, property deeds, insurance policies, trust documents. I was surprised by how calm I felt discussing it all. Maybe because deep down, I had already mourned the family I thought I had. Your current estate plan gives Daniel significant authority, Martin explained carefully. If something happened to you unexpectedly, Melissa would indirectly benefit from nearly everything. That sentence settled heavily in the room. Indirectly benefit. Funny how polite legal language can sound colder than cruelty itself. Then we change it, I said. So we did. Piece by piece. Calmly. Methodically. The cabin would be sold eventually, with profits transferred into protected educational trusts for Sophie and Ethan that neither parent could access. Daniel would no longer serve as executor. Certain charitable donations Harold always talked about, but never finalized, would now be included permanently. Most importantly, control over my estate would pass through an independent trustee instead of family hands. Martin watched me sign document after document in complete silence. Finally, he spoke carefully. You know they are going to notice eventually. I capped the pen and looked directly at him. That depends on whether they ever cared about me or only what I could give them. On my way home, my phone buzzed through the car speakers. Melissa. I let it ring twice before answering through Bluetooth. Hi, Evelyn, she said brightly, her voice suddenly warm again. I was thinking maybe we should all have dinner this weekend and clear the air. I almost admired the timing. People become amazingly affectionate when they sense money moving away from them. That is thoughtful, I replied calmly. Family is important, she said quickly. Exactly, I said softly. That is why I have started taking mine more seriously. And for several seconds after I hung up, I sat at a red light smiling to myself for the first time since my birthday. Over the next 2 weeks, Melissa transformed into the most attentive daughter-in-law I had seen in years. She called twice just to check on me. She sent photos of the children with little heart emojis attached. One afternoon, she even dropped off homemade banana bread at my front door, which was especially amusing because Melissa did not cook unless another person was watching. The performance would have been convincing if I had not finally learned to watch actions instead of words. The real clues appeared in small moments. Daniel suddenly started mentioning rising interest rates during casual conversations. Melissa brought up retirement communities twice in one lunch. And both of them became strangely interested in the size of my house now that I lived alone. One Sunday afternoon, they invited themselves over after church. Melissa walked through my living room slowly with a coffee mug in hand, studying everything with the careful eyes of someone mentally rearranging furniture she did not own yet. This place is honestly too much for one person, she said casually while standing near the staircase. All these rooms must be exhausting to maintain. I smiled faintly from my armchair. I manage. Still, she continued, there are safer options for people your age. People your age. Funny how quickly families begin aging you once your assets become useful. Daniel sat on the couch pretending to scroll through his phone while Melissa wandered into the dining room. You know, she called out, if you sold this house in the current market, you would probably make an incredible profit. There it was. Finally, not hidden beneath fake concern anymore. Direct. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. And where exactly would I go afterward? Melissa returned carrying one of my framed family photos. We talked about maybe converting our basement into a really comfortable suite for you. Suite. Such a pretty word for losing your independence. I looked at the photograph she was holding. It had been taken 10 years earlier at the lake cabin. Harold was still alive then, smiling with one arm around Sophie while Ethan sat on Daniel's shoulders. Melissa looked younger too. Softer somehow. Or maybe I had simply not learned to see her clearly yet. That is generous, I said evenly. It makes sense financially, Melissa replied quickly. You would not have to worry about bills or maintenance anymore. And honestly, the kids miss having you around constantly. I almost laughed at that sentence. 2 weeks earlier, I was apparently an emotionally overinvolved burden. Now suddenly I was valuable again because they needed access to my property. Daniel finally looked up. Mom, we just want to make sure you are taken care of. Taken care of. Another dangerous phrase older people learn to fear. It often means somebody else plans to start making your decisions for you. Melissa sat across from me with her usual polished smile. We are family, Evelyn. Families help each other. The irony nearly choked me. Interesting, I said quietly. I thought families send invoices now. The room went silent instantly. Daniel looked embarrassed. Melissa's smile twitched slightly before recovering. I think we all said things emotionally that night. No, I replied calmly. You said exactly what you meant. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Melissa leaned forward with that same soft, controlled tone she always used when attempting manipulation. Look, we are trying to think long-term here. Eventually, you're going to need support. It would be smarter to prepare now while everybody is getting along. Everybody. Not me. Everybody. I studied her carefully then and realized something almost sad beneath all the greed. Melissa genuinely believed she was the smartest person in every room. She assumed kindness made people weak. She mistook patience for blindness. Worst of all, she believed older people eventually become too lonely to resist mistreatment if family threatens distance. What she did not understand was that loneliness stops frightening you once respect disappears. Before leaving, Melissa hugged me tightly near the front door. Think about what we said, she whispered sweetly. You do not want unnecessary stress at your age. I smiled politely while she walked toward their SUV beside Daniel. Then I closed the door slowly and locked it. Not because I felt unsafe. Because for the first time in my life, I finally understood exactly who was standing on the other side of it. 2 days before Thanksgiving, I invited the family to brunch at my house. Not dinner. Not a holiday gathering. Just brunch. Simple enough to sound harmless. Melissa accepted almost immediately, which told me exactly what I needed to know. People only rush toward reconciliation when they believe something valuable is waiting at the end of it. The morning arrived cold and bright, with thin frost covering the edges of the lawn outside my kitchen windows. I woke up early and prepared everything myself. Cinnamon rolls, bacon, fresh fruit, a breakfast casserole Harold used to love during football season. The familiar routine soothed me. There is comfort in doing ordinary things carefully while planning something extraordinary underneath them. Around 11 o'clock, Daniel's SUV pulled into the driveway. I watched through the curtains. 2 months later, I invited the family to Sunday brunch at the lake cabin. The invitation alone changed Melissa's entire personality overnight. Suddenly, every text message ended with heart emojis again. Daniel started calling twice a week just to check in. Even Melissa's tone softened into sugary concern whenever she spoke to me. "We are so excited to spend quality time together," she said over the phone 3 days before the brunch. Quality time. Funny phrase coming from someone who once calculated grocery percentages for her children eating at my table. The morning of the gathering arrived cold and bright, with fresh snow lining the roads outside Geneva on the lake. I woke early and stood for several minutes beside the kitchen window holding a cup of coffee, watching sunlight settle across the frozen lake behind the cabin. Harold loved this place more than anywhere else in the world. He used to say the water made people honest because silence always reveals who they really are. Around 11 o'clock, Daniel's SUV pulled into the driveway. Melissa stepped out first wearing an expensive cream-colored coat and carrying a pie she definitely did not bake herself. Sophie and Ethan ran ahead excitedly toward the porch while Daniel unloaded bags from the back. For a moment, seeing the grandchildren laugh near the snow-covered dock almost weakened my resolve. Almost. Inside, the cabin smelled like cinnamon rolls and coffee. I kept the atmosphere warm and pleasant. Melissa complimented the holiday decorations. Daniel talked about work. The children played card games near the fireplace. Anybody watching from outside would have believed we were a perfectly happy family. But beneath the polite conversation, I could feel Melissa waiting, anticipating something. She kept glancing toward the hallway where Harold's old office sat with the door closed. Around noon, there was a knock at the front door. Melissa looked confused when I calmly walked over and welcomed Martin Klein inside carrying a leather briefcase. Daniel's face immediately tightened. "Mom," he said slowly, "why is your attorney here?" "Because," I replied evenly. Family conversations are easier when everybody understands the same facts. The entire room changed temperature instantly. Melissa slowly set down her coffee cup. Martin greeted everyone politely before removing several folders from his briefcase and placing them carefully on the dining table. Sophie and Ethan looked confused, so I gently asked them to continue playing cards in the den for a few minutes. Once they disappeared around the corner, silence settled over the cabin. Melissa forced a smile. "Evelyn, this feels unnecessary." "Actually," I said calmly, "it is long overdue." Martin opened the first folder. "Mrs. Carter has recently updated her estate and property arrangements." Daniel blinked hard. "Updated." I folded my hands neatly in my lap. After my birthday dinner, I realized some boundaries did need clarification. Melissa's expression changed immediately. The confidence disappeared first. Then the color. Martin continued professionally. "The lake cabin will be sold next spring, with proceeds placed into protected educational trusts for Sophie and Ethan. The trusts cannot be accessed by parents or guardians." Daniel stared at me. "Mom." "Additionally," Martin said calmly, "Mr. Daniel Carter has been removed as executor of the estate. An independent trustee has been assigned instead." Melissa spoke before Daniel could. "You are punishing us." I looked directly at her. "No, I am protecting myself." The room fell silent again except for faint laughter from the children in the next room. Martin slid one final paper across the table toward them. "Mrs. Carter has also arranged substantial charitable donations benefiting children's literacy programs throughout Ohio." Melissa stared at the documents like somebody watching money physically disappear. Then finally, she whispered the question she had probably wanted to ask for months. How much are we getting? I smiled softly then. Not cruelly, just clearly. Exactly what you charged me for loving your children.